I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. I'm going to be doing three things in today's debate. First, I'm going to be presenting our model. Then I'm going to be talking about the fundamental problems that exist with the way voting works in today's world. And lastly, I'm going to be solve a bunch of those problems that we talk about. First, on our model, broadly, we think that the way these ballots would look like is they would have a bunch of policies that candidates broadly support. Things like carbon taxes, things like higher taxation on the top 1%, things like quotas for minorities. So there are a range of policies that are put forth on the ballot, and people get to choose on the when people get to choose which policies do they support and rank them on the basis of which they consider to be most important that they would like to see on the ground. On the basis of that, we then match it with the specific candidates who support those policies and those who have who sort of get the most number of policies that people support. They're the people who are likely to be elected. Notice that we're also happy to have a system where if you've implemented more policies in the past, you get a higher ranking in case you and another person have the same number of score in terms of the kind of policies that you support. Furthermore, notice that similar rules such as people with criminal backgrounds not being allowed to contest in elections will continue to exist even in our world. Second, then, on what we think are the structural problems that exist right now with the way voting works. The first thing to point out is that because voting is fundamentally based on the way a person looks, the way a person behaves, and the way their personality seems to you on the ground, often the kind of people who end up getting elected are straight white men. We see this happening in countries like the United States. In countries like India, the kind of person who often gets elected is the upper caste Brahmin who time and again becomes head of state again and again. We don't see people like women, people like from LGBTQ communities becoming getting positions of power, because the minute you start seeing them in campaigns, they're often seen as people who are not strong enough. They're often seen as weak-willed. The first questions you often ask to a female candidate is that, is this person even likable? Something we saw time and again with Elizabeth Warren's campaign, right? The problem is, given such massive stereotypes are attached to people from particular communities, it makes it really, really hard for them to break into the political system. The second reason why minorities and women are often unlikely to get elected in the status quo is because campaigns are heavily reliant on money right now. So you want people who have links and networks with people around you. You want them to be palatable to majority. You want them to be able to raise as much money as possible, because it's not about the specific policy that you support, but rather about, can you campaign in every nook and corner of the street and therefore ensure that this person's face is plastered all across different states, right? When that's the way in which campaigns are run, you don't have these people breaking into political positions of political power. The second problem is that grassroots campaigns often get massively hurt in the process. This is because people who are in positions of power and privilege and have lots of money often have attack ads against grassroots campaigns, against specific politicians, the way Hillary Clinton laughs, for instance, or the way a specific minority behaves. That means that often these attack ads targeted at minorities and specifically at grassroots campaigns means that these people are unlikely to be able to come up in politics because they're not able to spend the exact same amount of resources on having such advertisements. Problem is that these grassroots campaigns often have really, really good policies because they understand the concerns of people on the ground. They're often from these communities themselves, but they just can't afford to have, attack ad campaigns against established politicians. Thirdly, right now, the power that lobbying has is massive. The reason why lobbying has so much power in the status quo is because people don't care as much about policies. So companies like ExxonMobil can easily buy out politicians when the debate is often not about the specific policies that people want, but rather about the personalities of these politicians, right? And the problem is that the way in which the personality of politicians can be projected and reach a wide number of people is by getting money from these companies and then launching campaigns on the basis of that. On our side of the house, when you are less reliant on the personality of the person themselves, but more reliant on the specific policies that they pass, you can no longer afford to take money from these large corporations because you need to have better policy. You need to ensure that things like carbon taxes, things like higher taxation are actually being enforced on the ground. And that means that the kind of power that lobbying has on our side of the house significantly reduces. Fourthly, identity politics plays a critical role in today's world. Often your family, the people around you, your friends, the people who you talk to in your community ask you to vote for the person who looks like you and behaves like you. For instance, this looks like in countries like India, voting for the upper caste person or the person who is a Hindu, because those are the kinds of people who you believe you have an ethical and a moral obligation to vote for, to uphold like your religious identity. In the United States, it looks like people asking you to vote for Republicans because they represent the Christian ideals. They represent the family man, and therefore you need to vote for them. This sort of identity based politics where you start placing less importance on the policies that you pass, but rather on who the person actually is, what their identity is when you get such sort of cults of personality. This is particularly perverse in developing countries that have just come out of like colonialist past, right? In countries like India and South Africa, we've seen that the Gandhi name, for instance, in India ran the country for over 60 years. The reason why that was possible is because you build cults of personality around your name, and irrespective of the massive corruption or like bad policies that you pass, people will continue to vote for you because they attach a sense of identity with your personality and therefore don't look beyond that to the specific policies that you pass. Why then do we think blind voting is a better alternative to all of this? Before that, I take a POI from closing.
Even if you have the policy, passing policy relies on negotiation. How is a technocrat more likely to pass a bill when you still need the executive branch to work with other branches like legislative and also the judicial?
That is just an assertion that you can't like negotiate. Obviously, once you enter politics, once you get into making policy, you know that there has to be negotiations and you're more likely to do it. In fact, when you don't have identity politics, when you don't have to portray yourself as a strong man who doesn't back down, that is when you're more willing to negotiate, because your key concern is getting policies that help people on the ground and not like this image that you've built for yourself. Why do we think blind voting is far better to resolve these problems? The first thing is that it focuses more on policies because people actively vote on that. That means that your TV debates, that the campaigns that you run are based on specific policies and why those policies are better than other policies, as opposed to just what is the identity of these people. Second, you are more incentivized to research on the specific problems that people from specific communities face. For instance, what are the problems that indigenous communities face? What are the problems that specific communities face that you can put on the ballot box? Because you know that the only way to attract their attention is to refer to problems that they face in those communities, rather than just have your identity and have a name that gets you specific votes. Thirdly, it creates more accountability because now you can no longer claim that people just voted on the basis of your identity or on the basis of these on the basis of these arbitrary characteristics, but rather people specifically vote on the basis of policies that you've promised them. That means that there's more identity where you can point to the person and tell them that they have to build the policies that they promised for you. For all of those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their very kind speech and would now like to call upon the leader of opposition. Yeah.
We'll be switching seats, so give us a second. あとマイクずっと外れてる。Let me get my timer. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I'm going to start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I'm going to talk about 4 issues from LO. Firstly, I'm going to talk about personal identity and human nature, human nature and trust against this politician, why this is also an important metric. Secondly, I'm going to talk about things like strategic voting and single issue voter, why determining prioritizing certain consequence over other is something that's legitimate. Third of all, I'm going to talk about why these people have right to self-determine how they want to vote. Lastly, I'm going to talk about why this blind voting system is likely to lead to further exclusion of certain voters who might be apathetic. Before that, what do we stand for waiting outside? Firstly, we are okay with informing the citizens about this system and letting them do this system. If they have appeared to assume that this technology exists, we think that we are okay with these people having access to it. The crucial difference between outside is in outside, which person you vote is finally determined by this voter. And they could have other metrics like consequence, strategic voting, or the past personality of this person that can only be reflected on their outside. Under their side, it is based on automatic selection or automatic answer based on policies. And that's what they need to defend according to the info slide. So firstly, why blind voting system fails to reflect the human nature and competence of politicians and why that's problematic. Firstly, you are not able to vote based on the past behavior of these politicians or political party. For example, ruling party of Democrats in Japan failed to implement many of the action manifesto because they lack the competence or they lack the negotiation ability and within the games of politics. We think these kind of things are likely to be not reflected on their side. But secondly, you're not able to take in account the personality of these people. They may lack experience. They may be a rookie politician, or they may be just a random athlete without any political experience of negotiating with different people. But B, you're not able to take account the track record of the success of this politician. You might trust certain person over other because you know that this person meaningfully and 100% implement the manifesto that they said. But the lack of personality could lead to distrust within policy. For example, when you do things like adultery or cheating, whether this person can do things like childcare or nursery policy is likely to be questionable, or whether this person is making sexist remarks within certain public media and this scandal, whether this person can implement LGBTQIA policy or feminist policy might be questionable, because whether this person is willingness to fight, have the willingness or motivation to fight to ensure that this policy is implemented effectively or nuanced way is something questionable. That's why within their side of the house, ability to reflect these kind of important character of this politician is likely to be lost. But lastly, they also talk about things like corruption. It's not a government side where you are not able to hold these people accountable. On the opposition side, for example, in the case of South Korea, when the son was going to university based on corrupt system, this person image ruined and this person struggled to win the election. That only happens within outside when these people's personality are also held accountable. Why is this something important? Firstly, democracy is not only about accountability of democracy is likely to be lost within their side. Firstly, because even if you fail, you can get away with dodging the responsibility and making manifesto in the new election because you are not held accountable for the past experience. But B, there's likely to be moral hazards that even if you fail, you can dodge away the responsibility. So the incentive for these politicians to make sure the manifesto is actually implemented is likely to decrease within their side of the house. But second reason why this is important is democracy is also about consequence. Even if you have certain preference, if it's not implemented or if it's not actualized, that's not meaningless. So it's totally legitimate for you to care about consequence within outside of the house, given that it directly affects your livelihood and it's the policy that it directly affects you. Within their side of the house, they lose the ability to do that because they are not able to consider the competence. A, ability to make different policies and different compromise. B, negotiate with different diplomatics or trade deals to maximize the interest of the nations and the voter. That's why, for example, you may want to vote for Tony Blair's of USA because this person is a good diplomat. Or for example, you may not want to vote for Gordon Brown and instead vote for leftist party because this person is incompetent. This kind of decision making is only possible within outside of the house. Next argument, why trust and personality is particularly important. The first reason is there's many unexpected agenda that happens after the election. For example, economic crisis, COVID-19 crisis, natural disaster. In that circumstance, only metrics that is possible is trust against this person and competence against this person. And that's why we think that within election, being able to have the option to reflect that is particularly important. But secondly, in terms of identity politics, psychological confidence is something important. For example, you as a feminist want to vote for women politician, because this person, you feel that this person better reflects you. You know that this person has strong incentive and desire to make sure they are reflected. A, because they went through the similar experience as you, but B, because given that they are likely to be more nuanced and they are likely to be more strong when the compromise is being made and different negotiation is being made. That's why you may want support for certain people instead of tokenistic white heterosexual men who are putting in manifesto only for the sake of winning election. But lastly, even if change is not achieved on the outside, we think it's totally legitimate to vote based on empathy and sympathy of yourself. The subjective experience that you feel connectionship against this person is also a legitimate subjective way of voting, and that's disappear within their side. Third argument about strategic voting. Firstly, notice that strategic voting, like the likelihood of whether your voting becomes dead or countless, is something also important given the consequence is something important. So for example, even if you are ecologist, you may not vote for Green Party because you know that they have very small seat. You may instead want to vote for Democrats who are actually able to make coalition, who are actually able to make policies. We think that prioritizing certain consequence is particularly legitimate. But secondly, we think that there's a single issue voter prioritizing, given that people are multidimensional, prioritizing certain identity over others is something that is totally legitimate for these people to do. For example, you as women might prioritize a woman issue compared to other economic issue, for instance. But lastly, we think that apathy is likely to increase within their side also has. Firstly, because this test is likely to be long, given that in order to maximize the accuracy, you necessarily have to ask every single issue and every single policy, which is likely to be apathetic. Secondly, the type of individuals like poor individual or young individual who currently have low voting rate is likely to be de-incentivized to take part in this election, which means the ability to reflect these people is likely to be lost within their side. But lastly, grassroots movement is only possible within outside. The reason why Obama was able to win the election was they were able to galvanize support by making sure that these people feel represented. That sort of grassroots movement is only possible when there's actual campaigns that exist. For these reasons, that's opposed.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech and would now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Shih.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'm setting up a timer. I would prefer if your voice were offered that chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a variety of things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to quickly call out side opposition for their soft stance. Secondly, I'm going to go through some of the things that they said, contrast it with our case and prove to you why we're better. And finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the things that they dropped, which is the entire argument that we gave to you on things like diversity within politics and how voting on the basis of things like identity and like personality tends to cause for more like homogenous politicians, which is like people who are white, people who you typically tend to be trustworthy, etc. All right, then. Firstly, just really quickly before we continue in this debate, I just want to point out that side opposition cannot bring up their new model of like, oh, we're going to allow some people to do blind voting, and then like at the end they get to say yes or no on the basis of their politicians for a number of reasons. First, it's just that like it's not their burden. Their burden within this debate, as clearly stated by the motion, is to defend the current system. Secondly, even if they like had the ability to have that model, at the end of the day, when people still continue to choose, they're not going to look at the policies. They're just gonna like fill it random and then pick the politician who looks similar to them, who they think that they can trust at the end of the day. So biases are going to exist if they have this weird like soft line that they want to exist. So side opposition cannot have their cake and eat it too. Secondly, then let's take a look at the idea that like the ideas that side opposition, opening opposition brought out to you. The first thing they say is that personality is actually an important metric upon which you should vote. They essentially say this is because you need to know when you can trust people, and you need to know what kind of character they are, like what kind of policies, like are they more LGBTQ plus friendly, etc. A number of responses to this. First question that we gave in our very first speech told you that like we're going to ask them maybe some questions that could be like personality type, which might be which might be pertinent to politics, right? So for example, this looks like, what is their stance on LGBTQ plus rights, what is their stance on feminism. All of these things are going to be asked, and like these are things that like voters can rank as well, which we're going to be used for like matching as well. But secondly, note that I just want to like take a step back before we continue just responding to this idea, and notice how opposition is echoing the same words that we hear from like officials today, that the young politician isn't too trustworthy, that the woman who wants to stand for office isn't strong enough in terms of her character to stand up and negotiate, to stand up to leaders of the world. It is precisely this idea of trustworthiness and the idea of personality in politics that leads to worse policy making at the point at which you don't allow newer groups of people to enter politics, because that is when like you instead of like attacking their policies because they might be more difficult to attack, you attack their character and bring doubt on the basis of that. This is precisely what like prevents the political system of today from moving forward. And it's precisely the words that side opposition want to use, built upon. Trust is built upon like your prejudices that you've had since you grew up. It is the people that you saw around you, like your father figures, your right people of your own community. What that essentially means is that like either this trust is going to be built on previous prejudices, but secondly, this could also be trust that is built on the basis of things like a PR team. It's extremely easy to doctor like an identity when you're going into elections, to choose this kind of statements you made, etc. What isn't easy is to fake the literal policy platforms upon which you stand by voting for someone who has a fake personality, then to vote for someone who has a fake policy. And that actually brings me on to the third point, like within this debate, on the idea of accountability. Side opposition essentially tells you that the reason you are unaccountable is because you cannot see like the voter, and you cannot see the politician, and you cannot hold them accountable to that. Like therefore, this is blind voting is bad. A number of responses to this. Firstly, in our model, we already pointed out that we're going to take into account if certain individuals are refusing to like actually try to implement the policies. We can have ways of ranking these systems. Like if that doesn't work, here are more responses to that. The first thing to note here is that there are other politicians who can recognize when a politician is failing to actually implement the policies that they're running for. These newer politicians who want to compete could also run, and like they'd probably be like ranked higher, because these are people like, because comparing between someone who hasn't passed the policy and someone new who promises to pass the policy means that you're like the system is more likely to match you to the person who's newer and wants to promise this policy. But secondly, even if that doesn't work, the system's like you pass you on to someone who has similar views, even if it isn't the exact same person. But finally, note that at the point at which you see people like unable to like pass the certain policies that you want again and again, you might start to like think about like changing your policy. Like it might become more moderate. It might require that you need to like make some kind of like trade-off at the end of the day. Note accountability is actually much worse on side opposition side of the house, when they can say that like, look, we tried our best, but in the end you voted for my personality, you like, and like we need to run again. When they try to build these cults of personality around them, but even if their policies are ignored, they vote for the same parties and the same politicians because they think that they're trustworthy enough that they can break through, even if it isn't working, and like those politicians are actually the one who are like the ones that you like who are the ones that are harming the system. Before I move on to that like next set of like areas, I'd like to take a few while from closing.
Yes, identity is deeply connected to policy. Just like Republicans likely to vote on economic issue, Black people tend to vote on police violence issue. Why is this likely to be changed on your side, identity issue?
Okay, look, so while they're, okay, I'm actually going to talk about this right now. So how does this impact the kind of policies that come up? The first thing to note here is that many people are actually harmed by party lines, which is essentially, even if you support certain policies that exist outside of your party, you are forced to vote within that party. The people around you are voting for that same party as well. So even though personally, you might like even if your family is conservative in the UK and you don't believe in Brexit, you are forced to believe in the vote for the Conservative Party because one, you cannot vote outside of the specific party because of the identity that they've built, saying that we cater to you as people, but or secondly, because of the fact that like you literally haven't researched more policies, because at the end of the day, you know you're just going to make this decision on the basis of identity because that's what other people are voting on as well. But secondly, note that like at the point at which like people continue to vote upon identity because of the basis of these like singular policies, like note the issue here is that their best case becomes parallel, right? Which is both sides are going to have some grouping of identities. The weighing here is that on our side of the house, two things happen. Firstly, it is more likely that people cross over because they aren't bound by like these arbitrary community lines, because they can no longer see the faces of the politician, therefore they vote for the policies that are better for them. Or secondly, they aren't restricted by the fact like the color of their skin. So even if people have similar skin, like different skin tones from them, you're more likely just by like system of probability to have a more diverse parliament, which actually means you tend to have like more diverse parliament at the end of the day. Finally, note that you're actually likely to have better like negotiations on our side of the house. The reason for this is simple. This is because on our side of the house, there's a clear idea of what people want and how they rank them, which means that politicians can work together to try to focus on the issues that people want, because they want like people to vote for their policies as well. So note specifically then it's actually on our side of the house that you get better and more pertinent policies at the end of the day. This is crucial in weighing, because regardless of how much you trust a politician, on our side of the house, when you're actually able to get the policies that like the actual country wants without this without like the influences of these larger media corporations, etc., that is when we win this debate. I'm so proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their very fine speech and would now like to call upon the deputy opposition. Thank you.
Just checking my audible.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. And I think the previous speaker's video was a bit choppy for me, so I doubt if it is maybe my internet being unstable. So tell me at the point in which my internet became unstable. Right. Okay. The biggest nightmare in my life was the earthquake at March 11th, when Fukushima nuclear power plant got this accident and radioactive was actually spread. The prime minister at the time was ran by Democrats, which no longer exist in Japan, and now it's led by the LDP. What did this Democrat do at that moment is very, very terrible as a way of reacting to this accident. First, they hide where the wind is directed, and my place where I was living was hidden from where that wind is going. Therefore, I couldn't know where the radioactive is going, whether I need to evacuate. Two, this government also didn't show us which region should evacuate at that moment. But three, more terribly, this prime minister at that moment prevented measure from being implemented until prime minister go to this Fukushima and try look around what is going on, even though this person have no knowledge about nuclear at all. This is terrible, and no one really trusted this. And these kind of reaction to accident is something that we think is terrible, that we can't get rid of under our side of the house, which under sort of primitive never go. But more than that, in a principle level, I think it's just for me to hate these people and never vote them based on the principle of democracy, which is why we're more than confident to take this debate over the opening government. So firstly, I'd like to talk about this argument about representation from their side of the house and tell you why it is better under our side. So they talked about representation is going to be good, more women, it's more women, more minority. Only metric or like only mechanism from their side of the house is that it is possible to cross border. That's it, right? But I don't understand why like they're going to be minority representative in that very beginning. Why this is true? Firstly, because these political parties have no incentive on having a woman candidate, having a minority candidate to begin with. Several reasons. Number one, because oftentimes these political parties are already occupied by white male in that first place. What does this mean? This means number one, because of the proximity that this strong white man has, they have more incentive of choosing white person. But secondly, because they're no longer possible for people to vote for the race or the identity that this person has, then there are going to be no more incentive for this political party to have this minority representative under their side. But thirdly, because of the confirmation biases, so you know that many white men have succeeded in the very past, there are no more incentive for these politicians to try young people or women that their side of the house said. This is why they're going to be smaller incentive for political party to have a candidate representing the minority. Why this is going to be remedied in the status quo in our side of the house? Firstly, because you can obviously vote based on these issues, but secondly, you can grab the attention by having a very new kind of politician on our side of the house. But three, because it is attention grabbing, the media have an incentive to sensationalize that on our side of the house. But fourthly, because these minority issues are oftentimes very important, there are a number of the people who want to really support that. There are a number of the people who want to vote for Hillary Clinton just for the fact that she is a woman. Oh, I forgot about the model, right? I'll just go back. So the first thing I want to point out is that like looking at what PM said, it literally said they're gonna make this policy only based on policy and not on identity, and that is the premise for their case to stand. So DPM and also the closing government aren't able to shift that stance. But secondly, we're not doing this like partial blind voting. We're saying the system does exist in both worlds. However, we allow this system to be used by people to make them sure that they're voting for the right person, or just only for the purpose of gathering information. But the crucial difference is the final decision maker is you yourself. You get to know, aha, I'm going to be voting for Republican, and then turn on. That's a very difference. Having said that, I think already dealt with the representation. Secondly, I would like to talk about this materialization of policy and why this is important. Here, the response coming from their side of the house is that, look, lobbying is something terrible. But I think Toshiya clearly illustrated to you how lobbying can be held accountable under our side and it's impossible under side affirmative. Under side affirmative, it may be possible to kick out those who are ex-criminals, but it is impossible to kick out those who just deliberately choose not to carry out the policies which they have manifesto. They may say, this is a less of a priority. We didn't have enough amount of money. Why this is likely to happen under their side of the house? Firstly, because there's not enough amount of accountability in the first place, because these people can completely hide the identity at the point of next election. Therefore, they don't need to care about what is going to happen in the next election. But secondly, they can simply lie in this manifesto in the first place, right? In order to get some voting. Therefore, the additional model from DPM, that is to say, asking if this person likes LGBT or not, has no meaning at all, because you can just say, I like LGBT, even if this person hates LGBT under their side of the house, which is why it's going to be no accountability under their side of the house. But also, the materialization of policy is something very important on our side of the house, because one, it is what actually happens to our real life and something important. But two, the way how we deal with the crisis, as I said in the introduction, is something going to have an extremely big impact on people's life. But moreover, the cult of personalities, right? Let's respond to this. So they talked about as cult of personality is something problematic, but I don't think side affirmative have proven to that, except for saying corruption. But I think corruption is already dealt with. But so I like to talk about why cult of personality, even if we assume that is the case, why is not something that much of a big of a problem. Firstly, in order for cult of personality to exist, you need to have much more bigger benefit for people, so that people will fall into this cult of personality in the first place. Therefore, the likelihood is that this person is something really good. For example, like Gandhi is really good in way how you united this very divided India. Why this is actually important, right? Like case study. So in India, they were colonized by UK, and there was this active policy by UK implemented to divide population in order to make UK easier to colonize India, which is important to have this unity on our side of the house. That's why it's a big enough benefit on our side of the house. But more importantly, cult of personality can be translated to trust. Why this trust is important? This trust is not only from the people, but also from the colleagues. Why this is important? This trust and human connection is extremely important in carrying out policies, because this person can just simply filibuster and say, aha, I don't want to listen to you. I have no incentive whatsoever because I don't trust you. I hate you. In that instance, you cannot really materialize the policy on their side of the house, also, as well as the communication with the bureaucrats on their side of the house. But also, let's go on to the trust level of the individuals. Why it's important to have being trusted by the citizens under our side of the house. So let's say you cannot carry out policy under your side of the house because demonstration is something likely to happen. You don't have enough political capital to ignite change under your side of the house, or these people will try to, let's say, fill out the Wall Street or do some demonstration to cancel some certain policy, or try to ask for canceling a particular government. In that instance, this government is incapable. But here's the delta, right? Even if you are canceled, you can just rerun again with the same manifesto and get elected because of this blind voting system under their side of the house. Finally, briefly onto the principle. So why do we think it's important that these people have a subjective consent and subjective satisfaction to what they are voting? Firstly, because of the reciprocal obligation. The fact that these people are paying taxes, the fact that these people are giving out autonomy to the government itself, means that these people have a right to choose who you want to be governed with, regardless who do you want to be governed with in the begin with. But second, the fact that you have full consent means that you're satisfied with what you are voting for in the first place. So you understand what you are voting for, and you're the one who knows the best about yourself on your side of the house. Which is why, in terms of the subjective consent, we are completely fulfilling this all based on the principle of democracy. For all that reason, I'm very proud and confident to take this debate. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech, and that concludes the top half of this debate. I'd now like to invite the member of government here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Cool, thanks. Right, I'll take my POS in chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the reason I think we'll take above opening themes is because I think opening just massively overclaims the implications in this debate. The first question I want to ask is just what is this world reasonably like at the point that you change this voting system to blind voting? The first thing I want to do is just fill in a bit of model that I think just reasonably makes sense from the OG. If we are assuming feasibility, that probably means that in the state that what we are going to do in blind voting is that you have some kind of ability to rank choice or prioritize particular like policies that mean more to you than others. This is in line with ranked choice voting that already exists within the status quo. That means that strategic voting is still possible. I just don't think that ops problem of like you can't prioritize is really like imaginative enough to what blind voting is likely to look like. But the second question I have, and this is much, much more important, is how will political parties react? Because top half debates as if political parties will be a thing of the past the moment you have a blind voting system instead of voting directly for the candidate. But the reality is these are both just proxy measures to introduce and reach an understanding of what the individual voter wants at the end of the day. The question, therefore, is why do political parties exist? And at core, what I posit is that political parties emerged out of the fact that people wanted to push for the entrenched interests. They saw that a group of people had broadly similar interests, and therefore they figured that coming together to pool their resources and to establish this this ideological uniformity was a better way in which to achieve the end outcomes they want. The thing is, all of these interests, especially the more that the opening debate wants to couch it in things like lobbying and entrenched interests, all of these entrenched interests still exist in this world. It's not like you change the voting mechanism and therefore all of the interests of people change. Here is like trivial examples, when we change our voting system in Singapore to vote for 5 people at one time, that doesn't change the inherent structures that motivate this change in voting system, not that change the inherent structures that are going to compete for votes within these new systems. The reason this is important is that if political parties still exist, that means that rich parties will still likely have power. The difference is that what they're going to do is to have to specify their policies in their manifesto in order for people to know how to vote, in order to get to the desired outcome of voting for that particular party. The implication of this actually mitigates strongly a lot of the claims from opposition about how you want to vote. Because if you really, really want to vote on, like, I don't know, you touch heart, you decide you like this fellow, you can still do that on that side of the house. The only difference is we require you to now know their policies first and like be able to tick off a checkbox for these policies before you get to the voting booth. Then the biggest push from op that I think is quite interesting is, what if you've got a party with a really bad track record, right? And again, this argument works against OG, but not against the frame that we introduced, because it just doesn't make sense that these parties are amorphous concepts that don't still exist in the status quo. In the world that we live in today, what happens is that when like you have a party that's really bad, there's a tendency for people to switch to another party with a slightly different or significantly different party stance for 2 important reasons. The first is that there tends to be disillusionment with not just the implementation of the ideas, but also the ideas as a whole, because there is a doubt as to whether these ideas are even feasible in the first place. I think communism is a good example of an idea that has been generally dismissed, even though it is arguable that the implementation has generally been the problem. The implication of this is that on both sides of the house, you can simply choose to vote for a different set of policies in the election, therefore electing a different party. Therefore, this becomes the same. But second and more importantly, it's very rare that 2 parties are exactly the same, have exactly the same policy, because then you're seen as contributing nothing new or bring up policies that are already discriminated against or dismissed. In that world, it tends to be on both sides that a bigger party is going to win because of the increased resources that they enjoy, which in turn means that there's no comparative difference on that side, i.e. everything op is concerned about, we can do as well. Therefore, the central change in this debate is really that we force parties on our side to front up what their policy platform is. And for 2 reasons. The first is that if you don't have a clear platform, you can't even get on the ballot. So the mechanism of election forces parties to commit to particular party stances. And secondly, a party in which people don't know their platform can't vote. The fact that, for example, in the US, it has been, like, research has suggested that many Republican voters, for example, don't actually know any Republican policies apart from a single one. That will be no longer exist on our side. Because if as a party, you cannot educate people on which boxes to check, they are not going to end up accidentally not voting for you, which creates strong incentive structure for the party to have a clear policy and a policy that people actually understand what you're standing for. There are 2 important benefits of this. The first is that trivially we get significantly more informed choice, and this is incredibly important. There are 2 problems in the status quo that this solves. The first problem is that in the status quo, parties tend to be unclear what they stand for. They flip-flop or they fail to commit to particular clear stances that can even remotely resemble a policy, because they don't want to be held to this, or because they just haven't done the background research, for example, populist campaigns. There's a disincentive to do that now because if people don't know what you stand for, they're confused, they're just not going to vote for you by accident, which in the end still means that you're not elected. Second, parties highlight particular policies to some people but not others. And this is really important because in a world where data is increasingly collected, parties have been able to highlight to a poor Christian, for example, that abortion is something that they stand against, and highlight to a rich, socially left individual that they will reduce their taxes. The implication of this is that it creates false coalitions because you change the way in which people prioritize issues by trying to hide particular policies from them in order to push particular policies that uniquely benefit them. These false coalitions change on our side because now individuals must consider each and every option that is on the table because they will have to tick through these checklists in order to get to the vote. The second thing to note is that this actually facilitates actual debate on policies. I posit that the biggest problem in the status quo is an inability to pin stances of parties, which means well-researched parties lose out to less well-researched parties that just obfuscate reality, kind of like debating. And the implication of this is that there's a loss of ability to actually create the grounds for discussion on policy in the status quo. That changes at a point that you at least are able to pin people down to particular stances because everybody considers and recognizes and knows of these stances. Opening.
Right. We also allow these people to use this system as a way of gathering information, but also I think information in general is something publicly accessible. Tell us the delta of your education part.
I actually did earlier, right? The point is that in the status quo, there's a lack of clarity that you don't actually need people to know what you stand for in order for them to vote for you. Why is this a good thing, therefore? The claim on that side is that people can vote any way that they want. I agree. Cults of personality might well still exist on my side of the house. But the difference is that at least on our side, we force people to consider the guaranteed implications first. They are definitely going to happen because the party is going to try to ram these particular policies through. And this leads into a discussion of what democracy is. I don't think democracy is about outcome that you get in terms of like left wing is good, minorities are good, because that's not what democratic systems are set up to achieve the outcome of. What we want in democracy, therefore, is about maximizing the extent to which we have informed consent and are able to recognize and reflect the preferences of individuals, because that is the way through which we genuinely grant dignity to individuals, i.e. allowing their views to matter within the public sphere. Therefore, what we posit is that a world in which we ensure that we can account for the most tangible implications of their vote and ensure that people account for that is a world that is a better world that ensures that individuals are going to have their votes more accurately reflected within the system. That is therefore a system that avoids the problem of uninformed and consent that where people are lied to on the side of opposition. That is something we propose.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech, and I would now like to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
to vote for the safest choice, a policy that is most likely to be passed, right? Because for decades, people have seen the promise of universal medical health care. People have seen that it's extremely good for you if you can able to actually have a lot of public housing, etc. Oftentimes, those policies don't get passed exactly because of the vested interest, right? So this is exactly why in the status quo, you have moderate party, right? This means that you're likely to distance voters. You're on their side of the house, you are likely to distance voters who are very rational. But secondly, who are the other voters you're likely to do? Especially when you have the technocratic languages, for example, that is why you're likely to technocratic language. You're likely to the voters are likely to feel extremely boring, so they're not likely to listen to the manifesto, right? So why is this going to be bad? This is going to be bad because exactly that those campaign promises like to be extremely vague, extremely rhetorical, so that it makes it more interesting, right? I think politics at the end of the day is about which side can actually rally their base to turn out, right? Why is this extremely important? I think this is extremely important for both sides of the house, right? If you're talking about Republican Party, it is important for the reason why Donald Trump is able to win is because he has this base able to vote in the rural area, right? Why you can have people like AOC able to win is exactly because she has the voter base able to come out for her and challenge the establishment, right? Those are the things that cannot really happen when you have abstract and vague concept that exists, right? This is the most realistic characterization on outside of the house. This is why this is extremely important. The second reason why we win, this is something that the neither side of the house deal with, is that this is problematic because when voters only deal with the short-term issue, they actually neglect a lot of the long-term issue, right? So I think that on their side of the house, when you have this like policy being happen, you're likely to have a lot of stimulus, right? You have a lot of political caddy that exists. For example, giving away free money and not caring whatsoever about exactly how you're going to be able to spend it, because I don't think voters actually do care. I think secondly, you're actually likely to have like party entrenchment and then race to the bottom that exists, right? I think there's a time in the political machine, for example, in the 1960s, for example, when both sides of the party is trying to give as much benefits towards the working class, for example, giving that huge amount of money, basically trying to buy their votes, right? But they have no long-term strategic planning. I think this is extremely bad. I think that a country, in order for it to be prosperous in the long term, it ought to care about long-term issue. Why is this important in this debate, right? So I think that when you need to, this is likely to cause long-term issues, exactly like open opposition tries to care about, like economic crisis is likely to be happening, right? Third issue why we're likely to win is we explain why on the outside of the house, actually minorities on their side of the house, minorities likely to be explained for three crucial reasons. One, because the policies and the language is unlikely to speak to them. Secondly, it is not as technocratic. But thirdly, I think that exactly because on their side of the house, rich party can have the research, right? Let me characterize how this looked like. This looks like parties able to spend millions of dollars on focus group, on data scientists, which is the policy issues that people do care about, and they can simply craft a message that they can happen, right? Comparative on the outside of the house, when you have representative like AOC, Omar Ilhan, that's crucially when you get people to feel connected, right? Look, why I don't see that CG's frame is actually able to take this out, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the problem is that when you vote for this political party, it is still quite connected to it, right? Just like, for example, when you as a Republican, you still have a lot of entrenched belief. When white Anglo-Saxon, like Protestant belief, like they're hugely associated with like anti-vax, for example, because of the news media that they consume, right? Why is this damaging to their case? I think this is extremely damaging to their case because it doesn't really because this actually damaging to the incentive of the governing party, right? I think that Shaun is able to prove that governing party do have some of incentive to make sure that their voters is actually informed, but they do have this countervailing incentive to simply attack the other side on the issue, attack the core identity. This can still happen within the manifesto, right? Exactly because these political party have an incentive to actually have you vote in the same line. That is crucially when the political parties are going to research what the opposition party does, try to like frame it as bad, and try to convince the voter to vote on the same issue. But then when they get into power, they're not going to actually carry out this issue, and this is why this is doubly bad, right? I think that crucially, I think crucially, when you have people of that minority, right? Why does people like a Kamala Harris matter? I think crucially, this means like criminal justice is able to be matter, right? When you have a personality, when Black people is willing to vote for them, when people are willing to vote for people like Kamala Harris, that is crucially when you have like reform. When you have people like Joe Biden trying to restore the soul of America, right? That is when you're likely to talk about issue about like BLM matters, right? It's not just purely an economic issue that matters. Why is this very important? I think here's the framing that important. A lot of the times, the things that are oppressive, that minorities don't get access to. For example, number one, I think housework, right? Women is not actually the housework is not actually considered in the part of GDP. Secondly, environmental issues is not being concerned, right? Exactly when you have these issues concerning about bread and butter issue talked about, and no amount of value, no amount of characteristic talk about, that is crucially when you as the candidate other kind of issues, for example, like Green New Deal, like the future of your country is important, right? Exactly when you need to care about like Blacks issue, when you care about minority issue, that is the thing likely when it's most important. Here's how this debate work out, right? I think closing opposition is if you take the opening governments like metric, their side don't actually solve like political dynasty. Their side are unable to actually prove why grassroots campaign actually is able to be solved. I think the problem with like opening opposition is that yes, you can have people caring about this identity. You can have people caring about like identity, but I think on their side of the house they don't actually talk about the long-term issues that exist, right? At best, you talk about Obama being elected. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech, and I thank everyone for this excellent debate. I think everybody now has to leave the room so the judges can deliberate. You will get to know the verdict as soon as it's